Survivor is awesome. This highly competitive game is often compared to professional sports like the NBA and NHL. The only problem is there has never truly been a Survivor tournament. Well, until today. I'm bringing together your favorite Survivor content creators to decide once and for all the best season of Survivor. In my opinion, this collab is on Avengers Endgame levels of awesomeness. I'll be releasing the Survivor YouTuber season rankings soon, but while we wait for that, I want to get the community involved. And while there have been many Survivor season rankings done in the past, there has never been a Survivor tournament. Well, until right now. But then that begs the question, what does a Survivor tournament really look like? Think of the Survivor tournament as like the NHL or NBA playoffs. You got the Western Conference on one side and the Eastern Conference on the other. And you have the best seeded team playing against the worst seeded team. But there's one big issue with this. Normally in Survivor season rankings, you have heroes versus villains and Kagayan in the top two battling it out. Spoiler alert, that doesn't happen here. And that's because everything is all random and heroes versus villains and Kagayan actually ended up in the same conference. A little bit of ground rules before we get started. 6 rounds total, single knockout elimination, 22 seasons get a bye to the second round. This video is sponsored by my Discord, and in fact this entire tournament idea came from the Discord community. You should go check it out, link in the description. Going into round 1, I saw 3 really interesting matchups that I didn't know how the community would react to. Island of the Idols versus Season 41, Tocantins versus Cook Islands, and China versus Borneo, but this is what ended up happening. San Juan del Sur versus Marquesas, Gabon versus Pearl Islands, Palau versus Heroes versus Villains, Tocantins versus Cook Islands, Cambodia versus Guatemala, Island of the Idols versus Survivor 41, Samoa versus Philippines, the Australian Outback versus Koh Rong, China versus Borneo. Going into round 2, I knew we were going to have more controversial matchups, with Survivor San Juan del Sur and Blood vs. Water battling it out, the 2 Blood vs. Water seasons, Micronesia and Pearl Islands battling it out, 2 fan favorite seasons, and then 2 matchups where I had no idea what was going to happen with Caramoan versus 41 and Africa versus Edge of Extinction. And the community did not disappoint at all with how the polls went. We had 3 polls with such a wide spread at 96% versus 4%. Those were Cagayan versus Fiji, Heroes versus Villains versus South Pacific, and Thailand versus Philippines. And we had a super close matchup at 55% to 45% in Africa and Edge of Extinction. Let's go roll the results. Panama versus David versus Goliath, Cagayan versus Fiji, Africa versus Edge of Extinction, Heroes versus Healers versus Hustlers versus Millennials versus Gen X, Ghost Island versus Redemption Island, Worlds Apart versus Game Changers, Blood versus Water versus San Juan del Sur, Micronesia versus Pearl Islands, South Pacific versus Heroes versus Villains, Survivor 42 versus Tocantins, Nicaragua versus Cambodia, Caramoan versus Survivor 41, All-Stars versus the Amazon, Thailand versus Philippines, Winners at War versus Koh Rong, One World versus China. Round 3 was when things really started to get interesting, and you could notice that one side of the bracket was way more competitive than the other side. We had Micronesia versus Heroes versus Villains and Tocantins versus Cagayan all on the same side of the bracket. And let's roll the results. Blood versus Water versus David versus Goliath, Micronesia versus Heroes versus Villains, Tocantins versus Cagayan, Cambodia versus Africa, Survivor 41 versus Millennials versus Gen X, All-Stars versus Philippines, Winners at War versus Ghost Island, China versus Game Changers. We are now entering the quarterfinals. This is round 4, and this is where it became super apparent that the random draft order made one side of the bracket so much more competitive than the other side. On one side of the bracket, you had David versus Goliath versus Heroes versus Villains and Cagayan versus Cambodia. And on the other side of the bracket, you have Millennials versus Gen X versus Philippines and Winners at War versus China. This was the moment we had the closest poll out of the entire tournament. Just for some backstory, at the time this poll came out, I was on vacation enjoying myself. I was catching myself refreshing the poll all day long because it was literally neck and neck for the entire 24 hours. One of the 2 teams ended up winning 51% to 49%. Let's roll the results of round 4. David versus Goliath versus Heroes versus Villains, Cagayan versus Cambodia, Millennials versus Gen X versus Philippines, Winners at War versus China. Entering the semifinals, one of the matchups was super interesting because everyone in the comments was arguing about how that matchup actually should have been the final matchup. And that was, of course, Heroes versus Villains versus Cagayan. And on the other side of things, we had Philippines versus Winners at War. Look, these are 2 perfectly good seasons, even great seasons of Survivor. But if you would have told me both Survivor Philippines and Winners at War made the semifinals of a Survivor season tournament, I just wouldn't believe you at all. And let's roll the results. Heroes versus Villains versus Cagayan, Philippines versus Winners at War. Obviously, the final round we have Survivor Heroes versus Villains and Survivor Winners at War. Although this wasn't the matchup I was expecting, it's pretty cool to see Season 20 and Season 40, both anniversary seasons, battling it out in the finals. And with it coming down to 72% versus 28%, here's an overview of the entire tournament if you're curious. I'm super hyped for the Survivor YouTubers season rankings with all these YouTubers. Anyway, make sure to subscribe for more Survivor content as we try to pass Russell Hantz. And click right here for the most iconic Survivor moments. Peace!